Is that the sense that you're getting over there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent that was a given even before we started this week. It's always been known that the biggest player, or at least one of the two biggest players in this, the US, would not be able to commit to anything until the legislative process had been completed, and that requires a bill being passed through the Senate. And that's why we already knew that we were not going to get a legally binding agreement. What we were looking for is a political agreement for legal inaction later on. And that probably did suggest that a further summit would be required. Whether that's going to be in Bonn or whether that's going to be in Mexico, we don't know. The problem with Mexico, of course, is then you start getting into the midterm elections in the US, and again you have the problem of the US administration under Obama being unable to commit to something ambitious when the major political domestic forces in the US are going to be mounting their opposition. So we want to see something probably in the early part of the new year, or at least before the summer.
Well, we've just focused a lot on the United States in the last 20 minutes or so, but of course China's a big player as well, and the Swedish Prime Minister has said that if the US and China don't do their parts to target this and reach their targets, then nothing is going to work. The two account for almost half the world's emissions. We've had the Environment Minister of the EU President coming out and saying that the real problem is that the US and China are both not delivering enough. The US is coming in too late. China is blocking it again and again. Mr. Smith, is it just really about these two? Should the US and China just go and sit around a table somewhere and figure out what's got to give before all the world leaders come around the table again?
Well, I think, obviously China is, becoming the dominant superpower. And one of the problems we have, of course, is their rising emissions will pretty much cancel out anything the UK does, just our country alone. I think the problem Obama's got, of course, is China has actually been paying America to run up a lot of debt. China kept a lot of currency. So in a sense, China has a very big stake in America. So he isn't in that strong a position to, fight with them, because they own large chunks of America's debt. And if they asked America to repay it, America would probably be bankrupt. I do think, this might sound rather simplistic. One of the reasons China's emissions are so enormous is because we're getting them to make everything for us. And in a way, how much responsibility should we be taking for the rise of emissions because of what we've bought from them? That's something that, again, doesn't get discussed that much. If we want to really stop China's emissions rising, we should stop buying things they've manufactured in a non-environmentally friendly way.
Mr. Slater, we kind of get the sense of why this is going round and round over there in Copenhagen, because every time we say, well, China should take some responsibility, we say, well, it's not China's fault, the US shouldn't be buying so much, and then it goes round and round. So it's really getting to the crux of the matter, is how on earth do we go forward from here, and how do you separate who should take what burden and at what percentage?
Yeah, it's very tough. This is a very tough argument. That's why if it were easy, it would have been solved a long time ago. That's why after some years and now months of negotiation, we're now at a point in this conference that we're probably just going to have to come back, as your guests have said, for another conference. China is going to have to take responsibility by saying, yes, we are an emitting nation, and we're going to have to be open to more transparency. After all, as President Obama said in Copenhagen, what's the point of just saying you will do something if no one can monitor to determine whether you've done it? Meanwhile, the United States has to take the political step to significantly from our point of view, cut greenhouse emissions. We are a big emitter. We have to take that. It's a difficult political stand. And as one of your guests just mentioned, we're going into a midterm election, if this thing continues, where it will be politically increasingly difficult for the Obama administration and Democrats to produce something meaningful when the Republicans and business interests in the United States are fighting so strongly against it.
Let's bring in some other views now. That's the politics of it. It's obviously there, but Mr. Zeng Helis, we've had India's Prime Minister come out and he said each one of us acknowledges that those worst affected by climate change are the least responsible for it. Whatever emerges from our negotiations must address the glaring injustice to the countries of Africa, injustice to the least developed countries, and injustice to the small states whose very survival as viable nations is in jeopardy. And that really is a reality. When you take all the politics into account, is this something that's seriously being acknowledged at this summit? I mean, words are wonderful, but is this something that they really are taking seriously?
Well, of course, that account is absolutely right. You need to demonstrate to developing countries that you can attain low carbon growth in a way that doesn't compromise your aspirations for attaining similar living standards, if possible, to those in developed countries. And you have to be mindful of the fact that in the process of developing, the rich world has been responsible for the bulk of the stock of emissions that are already out there, and that's what's causing global warming. So that's why it is right that developed countries take tough targets now, but also support developing countries in their investment in low-carbon technologies and low-carbon infrastructures. And that requires loans of the kinds that have been discussed, it requires risk guarantees, and it requires allowing developing countries to make money out of selling credits into carbon markets, but to do so in a way that's of a much greater scale than they've done already. Only then, and only when we can demonstrate to those countries that they can prosper and reduce emissions, which indeed they can, would we then be in a position to ask for those countries to take on targets of their own. But that should not be the case yet, with the exception of the bigger developing countries, China and India, who have already accepted some targets of their own.
Mr. Slater, where you are in the United States, as Barack Obama was speaking, the Senate had just approved the annual military budget. It was up by 4%. One of those protesters out on the street were critical of that. They say that if only half of the military budget was spent on this issue, then the world's problems when it comes to climate change would diminish. They say that while more people die from climate change than they do from terrorism, and that there needs to be a real reassessment of how money is being spent and how the world is being looked at. Is that a realistic demand?
I'm glad you used the word realistic, and I want to offer up sort of a realistic from the United States perspective, although I think Americans understand and the argument of protesters and those who have questions about so much spending for a military budget. I see not much in the way of sympathy here and appetite in the United States to cut our military budget significantly in order to do anything like deal with climate change. So long as the United States feels that it is threatened by terrorism and other problems, you're not going to see a political interest here in cutting our military budget. And as I guess you just said, I was watching earlier the Senate debating the military budget. This passage is part of something independent in the minds of many Americans of climate change and money that could be spent for other things, including dealing with our economic difficulties. And
Mr.
that
Smith,
is
we're just running
military necessities.
Yeah, we're just running out of time.
That the average United States person thinks is necessary.
Well, we're just running out of time, so let me pass this very quickly over to Mr. Smith. Is that the problem, that we're seeing it independently?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's all about money at the end of the day. And, you know, if I think about the trillions, and I mean trillions of dollars that governments worldwide have used to bail out our failing financial system, if that money had been spent, we could give the developing world clean technology. You know, what we do need to try and avoid, of course, is letting the developing world make the same mistakes we did by building carbon-intensive infrastructures. But, you know, we're offering, you know, Hillary Clinton flew in yesterday and said, oh, we'll set up a fund for $100 billion. I mean, what's that compared to, as they say, the military budget, the bailout budgets? I just think we've got our priorities wrong. But, you know, at the end of the day, the human race collectively is only really waking up on a global scale. And we're only just really starting starting to get a grip of the challenges facing the world. So it's early days. Let's be optimistic, though. There is an awful lot of very positive stuff going out there. Some incredible moves forward in technology, you know, at a rapid pace. So, you know, even though there might not be a global agreement on a more localized level, country by country, city by city, there's a lot of people making a change. So let's try and be optimistic.
On that optimistic note, I'm going to have to end it because we're bang out of time, but founder of EcoTube, Chris Smith, joining us there from London, thank you. And also to Wayne Slater, and joining us on the phone